In a crowded Charleston courtroom, the air was thick with tension as the audience quietly observed the juvenile trial. Sarah Wilson, a black lawyer known for her unshakable resolve and fierce dedication to justice, sat silently, her eyes focused on the proceedings. But that peace was shattered in an instant. Officer David Reynolds, a man whose arrogance matched his authority, could no longer tolerate Sarah's silent presence. With a sneer on his face, he turned toward her, his words dripping with disdain. "Who do you think you are sitting here?" he growled, his voice loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "A woman who doesn't know her place?" Before anyone could react, his hand flew through the air and landed across Sarah's cheek with a sharp crack that echoed throughout the courtroom. The slap was sudden, violent, and a direct blow to not just her, but to the very core of the justice system itself. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The room fell into an eerie silence, the kind of silence that spoke louder than words ever could. No one moved, no one breathed. All eyes were on Sarah, who, despite the sting of the slap, remained unmoved. But what Reynolds didn't know, what no one could possibly anticipate, was that this one act of violence would not break Sarah. Instead, it would ignite a fire within her, a fire that would expose the corruption lurking beneath the surface of the justice system. Her calm, her silence was the real power, and in those few moments, the ground beneath them all shifted. The courtroom, once filled with routine legal proceedings, was now the battleground for something much larger. Something had awakened that could no longer be silenced, and Sarah Wilson was about to make sure that nothing would ever be the same again. The justice system would soon learn. You can slap a woman, but you can't silence the truth. The slap echoed through the courtroom like the reverberations of an earthquake, shaking the air and sending a chill through everyone present. For a fleeting moment, the entire room held its breath. The audience, the jury, the judge, even the stenographer froze. No one had seen it coming. The tension was palpable, thick enough to suffocate the air in the room. But Sarah Wilson? She didn't flinch. Her body remained as still as a stone, her posture unbroken, her gaze unwavering. The sharp sting of the slap lingered, but she didn't react. Not in anger, not in shock, not even in fear. She didn't blink, didn't rub her cheek, didn't look away. She simply stood there, in that courtroom filled with powerful men and women who had been complicit in a system that had never cared for people like her. The silence was deafening. Sarah didn't need to shout, didn't need to raise her voice. Her stillness was louder than any protest. It was a quiet kind of defiance, an unspoken challenge to everyone in that room. In the face of violence, she offered only silence. In that moment, she wasn't a woman caught in the midst of an injustice. She was a force, a quiet storm that had begun to stir. Reynolds, the officer who had struck her, stood there, dumbfounded. His eyes shifted nervously, darting from Sarah to the faces of the people around him. There was confusion, there was disbelief, but there was also something else, something primal. Fear. Fear that he had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Fear that Sarah's silence held a power he couldn't understand, let alone control. His hand trembled slightly at his side. For the first time in his career, Reynolds felt a flicker of doubt. In all his years of wearing a badge, he had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. No one had ever made him question his authority. No one had ever made him feel small. But Sarah Wilson, this woman who had not even uttered a word, was making him feel exactly that. Small. Insignificant. The tension in the courtroom grew, suffocating the air. Every person in the room seemed to hold their breath, waiting for something, anything to happen next. But Sarah remained motionless. Her eyes, calm and piercing, locked onto Reynolds as if she were looking straight through him. She was no longer just standing there. She was making a statement. Every second that passed without a word from her spoke volumes. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. His palms began to sweat. The courtroom was still, but it felt like 1,000 invisible eyes were watching him, waiting for him to make a move. The longer Sarah stood there, the more his confidence crumbled. He could feel it. Her silence was becoming a weapon, and it was turning the tide against him. He had always relied on his position, his power to command respect, but now it felt like he had no control at all. His breath hitched as he took a small step back, his eyes still glued to Sarah's. Her gaze remained steady, unbroken, like a wall he couldn't breach. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to scream. It was as if the very act of her standing there, quiet, composed, resolute, was enough to strip away everything he had believed in. The room was beginning to shift. Those who had once been passive observers of the courtroom drama now seemed to hold their breath. It was like a collective realization was dawning on them, that this wasn't just a courtroom anymore. This was a battleground. And Sarah Wilson, with nothing but silence as her weapon, had become the victor. Judge Thompson, who had been sitting silently at the bench, looked between Sarah and Reynolds. The lines on his face deepened, a mixture of uncertainty and concern flashing in his eyes. He had seen many trials, many cases, but nothing like this. This was not the kind of power he was used to witnessing. This was different. This was real. Reynolds shifted again, his mouth dry. The room was growing heavy with the weight of Sarah's stillness, and he was struggling to carry it. He had expected anger, outrage, even fear, but he had not anticipated this calm, unyielding silence that seemed to make everything he had done, every mistake, every wrong move, suddenly feel so insignificant that he cleared his throat, his voice faltering as he finally broke the silence. "What do you think you're doing, standing there like that?" he asked, but the question sounded weak, almost pleading. He tried to summon some authority back into his voice, but it cracked under the pressure of Sarah's unblinking stare. The silence stretched on. Sarah didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her presence was louder than words could ever be. It was like the air itself was charged with the unspoken understanding that something far larger was unfolding before their eyes. This wasn't just about a slap in a courtroom anymore. This was about something much bigger, something that had been festering for years in the dark corners of the system. Reynolds felt his resolve falter. His jaw clenched. His eyes darted nervously around the room. He could feel the weight of every gaze on him, each one silently accusing him of something he could no longer deny. The silence that Sarah had created was not just uncomfortable, it was suffocating. And yet, Sarah did not speak. She didn't move. Her silence became the loudest thing in the room. It was a silence that demanded attention, that commanded respect, that forced every person in that room to confront the injustice that had been done. She wasn't just a victim in this moment. She was the catalyst for change. Reynolds stumbled back, his steps hesitant, unsure. For the first time, he found himself questioning his own authority. And in that moment, Sarah Wilson, with nothing more than her silence, had already won. The room remained still, waiting for what would come next, as the realization began to settle in. The fight for justice had only just begun. Sarah sat in her office long after the courtroom had emptied, the weight of what had happened pressing on her chest. The slap, the silence, everything had shifted. But as the room around her remained quiet, her mind raced. She didn't need to say a word. She knew that now. But the real fight, the one she had been preparing for all her life, was only just beginning. For years, she had worked within the system. A lawyer bound by the rules, a woman who had climbed the ranks, seen the flaws and swallowed her frustration. But the slap? That was the moment the system had betrayed her. And with that betrayal, she realized she could no longer stand by and let it fester. The courtroom had been her battleground, but now she would take the fight to the heart of the system itself. The first thing she did was pick up the phone and make a call. It wasn't to the press, it wasn't to any of her colleagues. No, it was to someone much more valuable. Malik Rowe, a former officer with intimate knowledge of Charleston PD's internal workings. Malik had been a whisper in the back of her mind for years. A man who had seen the ugly side of the department and walked away when he could no longer stomach the corruption. "Malik," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "I need your help." His response was immediate, but his tone was hesitant. "You're sure about this? You know what this could mean for both of us, right?" She paused, feeling the weight of the decision but knowing there was no turning back. "If not now, when? The system is broken, Malik. We have to fix it. I need you to help me expose it." There was a long silence on the other end, the kind that spoke volumes. Finally, Malik spoke, his voice tinged with a mix of fear and determination. "All right, I'll help, but you need to be prepared. This isn't going to be easy." Sarah took a deep breath, her mind already calculating her next steps. "I'm ready. Let's get to work." The days that followed were a blur of meetings, hidden exchanges of information, and long hours spent sifting through old case files and records. Every time Sarah thought she had uncovered a piece of the puzzle, she realized there was more lurking in the shadows, more corruption, more cover-ups. Each discovery made her blood run cold. It was as if the justice system she had sworn to uphold had been a facade all along, a structure built on lies and manipulation. She knew she couldn't go public with any of this. Not yet. The time wasn't right. She needed more. She needed the kind of evidence that would leave no room for doubt. The kind that would bring the corrupt officers to their knees. Malik's help was invaluable. He provided her with access to confidential records, some of which had been sealed away for years, forgotten by most, but not by those who had benefited from their silence. The names on those pages were a who's who of Charleston's law enforcement, men and women who had been pulling the strings for years, controlling everything from arrest reports to fabricated evidence, making criminals out of the innocent and letting the guilty walk free. And there, at the top of the list, was Officer David Reynolds. As Sarah flipped through the documents, a deep sense of unease began to gnaw at her. Reynolds wasn't just another corrupt cop. No, he was at the center of a larger, more insidious web. A web that had been designed to keep the truth buried and manipulate the outcome of every investigation. The very same man who had struck her had been orchestrating the downfall of so many innocent lives. And she was just one of many casualties. The more Sarah dug, the more her disgust grew. But there was something else that began to surface, something that made her blood run even colder. The more she uncovered about Reynolds, the more she realized that his power didn't just extend within the police force. No, it reached into every corner of the city, through the courts, the mayor's office, even into the media. He was untouchable. Sarah spent sleepless nights poring over every document, cross-referencing names, dates, and locations. She was building a case, but it wasn't just any case. It was a case that could bring down the entire system. She knew the risks. One wrong move, one slip-up, and she could become just another name on a list of victims erased from history. But the thought of that made her more determined than ever. As the weeks passed, the pressure began to mount. Sarah could feel it in the air around her, a sense of unease that followed her everywhere she went. The phone calls, the glances, the whispers, She couldn't ignore them. The system knew she was getting too close to the truth. They were watching her. But Sarah wasn't backing down. One evening, as she sat at her desk, piecing together the final details of her investigation, she received a call. The number was unfamiliar, but something about it felt wrong. Her heart skipped a beat as she picked up the phone. Sarah Wilson. The voice on the other end said, low and deliberate. We know what you're doing. If you stop now, no one else has to lose anything. But if you don't, the consequences won't stay political. Her hand clenched around the phone, her pulse racing. This was it. They were threatening her. But she had come too far to stop now. Who is this? She demanded, her voice steady, though she could feel the cold sweat gathering on the back of her neck. Doesn't matter, the voice replied. You know what's at stake. Drop it, and we'll forget this ever happened. The line went dead. Sarah sat there, her mind whirling, her thoughts a blur. They were trying to intimidate her, scare her into backing down. But that was the thing about fear. It only works if you let it. And Sarah wasn't about to let them win. She leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath. She knew what she had to do. She wasn't just going to expose the corruption. She was going to tear it apart piece by piece. And when she did, she would make sure the entire world knew the truth. The investigation had begun, and there was no going back. The room was dark except for the pale light of the desk lamp that illuminated the papers spread before Sarah. Her fingers shook slightly as she flipped through the stack of documents, each one more damning than the last. It felt like the walls were closing in, the silence in her office amplifying every crackle of paper, every flicker of her pulse. She'd spent weeks collecting these, piecing together a puzzle so vast, so intricate, that it threatened to overwhelm her. But she couldn't afford to be overwhelmed, not now. She'd come to FAR.s. She sifted through the latest batch of files Malik had helped her acquire. A pattern began to emerge, one that made her stomach twist. It was more than just a handful of bad cops or isolated incidents. This was an entire system built on lies. A system designed to keep the truth buried and the guilty free. Her hands trembled as she pulled out a particular file, its contents heavy with implication. It was a record from a case years ago, one that had been mysteriously closed without any real investigation. The name on the file jumped out at her, Michael Bell, the very same man whose wrongful arrest had sparked this entire journey. At first glance, the case seemed like just another of the countless miscarriages of justice that had plagued the system for years. But as Sarah dug deeper into the documents, her heart raced. There, buried beneath pages of official-looking reports, was something shocking. An internal note from Officer Reynolds himself. The words on the page were chilling. It detailed how a fabricated charge had been filed against Michael Bell to cover up a botched police raid. The charge wasn't just a mistake. It was part of a pattern, a deliberate attempt to manipulate the system, to cover up mistakes and protect officers who had overstepped their bounds. What was worse, the entire case file had been altered, with key evidence erased or altered to make it look like Bell had been guilty of a crime. Sarah's stomach churned as she realized what she was holding. This wasn't just an isolated incident. The same pattern was repeated throughout the force. Corruption had been systematically embedded in the police department, and the entire judicial system had turned a blind eye to it for years. Her breath caught as she turned to the next document. A case file from another officer, a higher-ranking official this time, detailing a secret meeting held behind closed doors. In the meeting, officers had discussed how to cover up another crime, this time involving a local politician who had been involved in a hit-and-run accident. The file was explicit in its details, listing how evidence had been reclassified to protect the politician and how officers had manipulated the investigation to make it look like an accident was nothing more than a minor mistake. The file was marked confidential. But Sarah knew it wasn't just about keeping secrets. It was about protecting a system of power that had corrupted everything in its wake. Her hands shook as she rifled through more files, each one painting a clearer picture. The names, the dates, the accounts, they all connected in ways that made her feel like the very floor beneath her was shifting. She was standing on the precipice of something massive, something so deep and dangerous that it could topple everything. But it was more than just the evidence, it was the realization of how it had all been buried. The police had erased the truth from their records, destroyed evidence, manipulated case files, and silenced victims who had dared to speak out. She had seen corruption before, but this was systemic. This was the foundation of the justice system itself. The very laws she had sworn to uphold had been manipulated, twisted, and concealed by those in power. Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she read through one final document. It was a detailed report from the Internal Affairs Department, written by one of the officers involved in the cover-ups. The officer, a man by the name of Eric Whitaker, had written a report that showed the full extent of the department's attempts to erase the truth. The report detailed how cases were routinely swept under the rug, how officers had been given the green light to handle situations however they saw fit, and how the higher-ups had used their power to manipulate outcomes. It was a damning account of how the police force had become nothing more than a tool for the powerful, a way to maintain control over the city and its residents. The final paragraph of the report made Sarah's blood run cold. "We are the ones who decide who gets to be guilty and who gets to walk free. The law is ours to control, and we will ensure it is used as a weapon of the state, not for justice." The words burned into her mind. It wasn't just a system of corruption. It was a system of control, a web of lies spun to protect the powerful and crush anyone who dared to stand in their way. Sarah slammed the file down on the desk, her heart pounding in her chest. The enormity of what she had uncovered felt like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. This wasn't just about Officer Reynolds anymore. This was about a corrupt system that had been running unchecked for years, and she was the one who had to expose it. Her mind raced, her thoughts frantic. She had the evidence now. She had everything she needed to bring the truth to light. But she knew the danger she was in. The system was not going to let this slide. Reynolds and the others would stop at nothing to protect themselves. They would go to extreme lengths to silence her, to bury the truth once again. And yet, Sarah knew she had no choice. The truth had to be exposed. She couldn't walk away now. Too many lives had been destroyed by this system. Too many people had suffered because of the lies, the cover-ups, the manipulation. With shaking hands, she picked up the phone and dialed Malik's number. He picked up after the first ring. "Malik, it's time," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I have everything. We're going after them." There was a moment of silence before Malik spoke, his voice low but resolute. "Are you sure? This isn't just a case anymore, Sarah. This is war." "I'm sure," Sarah replied, her gaze fixed on the stack of files in front of her. "It's time for the truth to come out." And with that, she made the call that would change everything. Sarah sat in the dim light of her office, the weight of the files spread out before her pressing down like a suffocating blanket. The documents were damning, irrefutable proof of corruption, lies, and manipulation within the justice system. But they were just the beginning. She had what she needed to expose the system, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. She had to do more. Her fingers hovered over the phone, trembling ever so slightly. She had already uncovered so much, but now she needed the faces, the names behind the stories, the victims who had been erased, whose lives had been destroyed by the very system that was supposed to protect them point one by one. Sarah began to reach out to the families of those whose cases had been swept under the rug, the ones who had been silenced, ignored, and forgotten. The weight of the task ahead felt overwhelming, but it had to be done. These families deserved justice, and so did their loved ones. She dialed the first number on her list, Tasha Bell, the mother of Micah Bell, the young man whose arrest had sparked everything. Sarah had seen the pain in Tasha's eyes the day she had shown her the files, the heartbreak of realizing that her son's name had been buried, that the truth had been erased. But now, Sarah had the power to give Tasha the justice her son deserved. She just had to get her to believe in it too. The phone rang twice before Tasha answered, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "Hello? Tasha, it's Sarah Wilson. I know this is hard, but I need to speak with you about your son's case. I've uncovered something that can change everything." There was a long pause, and Sarah could feel the uncertainty through the line. "What do you mean, change everything?" "Your son wasn't just another victim, Tasha. His case was part of a bigger plan, a system that's been erasing people like him for years. But I have the evidence and I'm going after it. I'm going after them. You're not alone in this. I'm going to make sure your son's name is restored. Tasha's breath hitched, a sob barely contained. You're saying you can fix this? I can, Sarah said, her voice firm. But I need your help. I need to bring this to the world. And I need your son's story to be heard. Will you stand with me? There was a moment of silence, and then Tasha's voice, small but resolute, answered, Yes, I'll stand with you. Sarah's heart clenched with a mix of relief and dread. This was it. She had her first ally. But as the conversation ended, the weight of what she was about to do settled heavily on her shoulders. The truth was dangerous. It would tear down a system and people would fight to keep it buried. The powerful people who had orchestrated the destruction of so many lives would not let it go easily. But Sarah had no choice. Over the next few days, Sarah made more calls. She reached out to the families of other victims, telling them the truth, showing them the evidence she had uncovered. Each conversation brought a different reaction. Some were hesitant, too frightened to speak out, while others were eager, their voices shaking with the anger and pain of years of silence. But slowly, the web of victims began to form. Their stories, once buried in shadows, were now rising to the surface. But with each call, the threats grew stronger. Sarah began receiving anonymous messages, threats to back off, to let it go. Her phone was hacked, her emails intercepted. She knew they were watching her. She could feel the eyes of those in power closing in on her. But she couldn't stop. Not now. Not after everything she had uncovered. One afternoon, as she sat in her office, the door creaked open. She hadn't heard anyone approach. A man stood in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a dark suit. His face was obscured by the shadows, but the cold, calculating look in his eyes was unmistakable. Ms. Wilson, he said, his voice low and smooth. We need to talk. Sarah froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had been expecting this, but she had hoped it wouldn't come so soon. Who are you? She asked, her voice trembling despite herself. The man stepped into the light, his expression unfazed. My name is Charles Granger. I represent the interests of those you've been targeting with your little investigation. You've uncovered quite a mess, Ms. Wilson. But you should know it's in your best interest to stop now. We can make this all go away, quietly, with no more mess. You and I both know how these things work. Sarah stood, her body tense, every muscle in her being telling her to run. But she stayed rooted to the spot. She had come too far to turn back now. You think I'm going to back down? She asked, her voice sharp. You think I'm scared of you? Granger smiled, but it was cold, calculating. Scared? No, but you should be. There's more at stake here than you realize. You think you can take down a system like this? Think again. Your system is broken, Sarah spat, and I'm going to fix it, whether you like it or not. Granger's smile faded. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You're not as untouchable as you think, Ms. Wilson. You keep pushing, and you'll find out just how far this system will go to protect itself. He turned and walked out of the room without another word, leaving Sarah standing there, her heart pounding in her chest. The walls were closing in, the threats were escalating, and yet she felt more determined than ever. She had the evidence, she had the families, and she had the truth. And no matter what came next, she would fight for them, for every victim, for every voice that had been silenced. And she wasn't backing down. The battle had only just begun. The days following Sarah's meeting with Charles Granger felt like a blur. The pressure was mounting, the threats becoming more persistent, and yet, with every passing moment, she could feel the weight of her decision to stand up for justice settling deeper into her soul. She had made it this far, and there was no turning back now. Her investigation had uncovered too much. The system was broken, and she was the only one who could fix it. But it wasn't just the truth that would take down the corrupt power structures. It was the voices of the people. The families she had reached out to were beginning to speak out, their stories spreading like wildfire. At first, it was just a handful of people, their voices shaking but growing stronger with each passing day. Then it was more families, more victims, more survivors, and the wave of resistance grew, rippling through the community like a storm gathering force. Sarah's phone rang constantly now, and it was never a journalist or a lawyer. It was a mother who had been silenced, a father whose son had been erased by the system, a child who had been forgotten. They were all calling, and they were all saying the same thing: I want my story to be heard. The voices were raw, filled with the pain of years of suffering. But there was something else in them now, something stronger. There was a determination to be seen, to be heard. Sarah felt that energy, that drive deep within her. The system had tried to silence them, to bury them under mountains of lies. But now they were speaking out. And it was like the floodgates had opened. It started small. Sarah posted an anonymous message online, a quiet call to action, urging others to share their stories. She didn't expect much, but the response was overwhelming. Within hours, the post had been shared by dozens of people, and by the end of the day, hundreds more had joined in, commenting, sharing their experiences, and telling the world what had been done to them. It wasn't just the victims themselves who were reaching out. It was people who had watched the injustice unfold, people who had turned a blind eye, people who had convinced themselves that someone else would fix the problem. But now they were standing up too. The pressure from Sarah's investigation was contagious. It was like a fire had been lit under the community, and people who had never spoken out before were finally finding the courage to do so. The media, once hesitant to touch such a sensitive topic, began to pay attention. Journalists who had turned a blind eye before now found themselves digging into the very system that had protected its corruption for so long. News outlets that had once been afraid to risk the wrath of the powerful now had no choice but to report on what was happening. They were uncovering more secrets than Sarah could have ever imagined. And then, one afternoon, it happened. A local news station aired a segment about Sarah's investigation. It wasn't just any segment. This was different. It was an in-depth, raw look at the families whose lives had been shattered by the system, combined with Sarah's meticulous evidence. They didn't just show the facts, they showed the faces, the pain, the tears, the lost lives. And in that moment, the community woke up. The segment aired during prime time, and the response was nothing short of extraordinary. People began calling the station, flooding social media with comments, demands for justice. It wasn't just the victims anymore, it was everyone. The outrage was palpable. The truth had been laid bare, and the community wasn't going to let it slide. Sarah's heart swelled with pride as she watched the flood of messages pour in. People were sharing their own stories, posting pictures of their loved ones who had been lost to the corrupt system. They were standing with Sarah, standing with the truth. The voices of the silenced were finally being heard. But it wasn't just words on a screen. It was more than that. People were taking to the streets. Small protests erupted in neighborhoods across the city, demanding justice, demanding answers. They weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for those who couldn't fight anymore, for the voices that had been lost in the system. One evening, Sarah received a call from Malik, his voice urgent, tinged with fear. "Sarah, they're getting desperate. I've been hearing rumors. They're planning something big. They're going to come after you hard." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. She had expected this. But she wasn't going to back down. "Not now. I'm ready, Malik. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone." It's about all the people who've been silenced. The protests grew larger. People of all ages, backgrounds, and races began to join the marches. They were united by one thing, the truth. The truth had sparked a fire in them, and they weren't going to let it die. Sarah could see it in their eyes as they stood in front of police barricades, holding signs that demanded accountability, signs that read, "Justice for the silenced." Their chants filled the streets, a unified cry that shook the city to its core. Sarah knew the dangers, knew that every step she took, every truth she uncovered, put her more at risk. But she also knew that the tide had turned. The people were no longer afraid. The media had caught on, and the system could no longer hide behind its walls of corruption. The truth was out. It was too late to stop it now. One night, as she watched the live footage of the protests, Sarah felt a tear slip down her cheek. It wasn't out of fear. It was out of pride. The fight for justice had grown beyond her. It had become something bigger, something beautiful. The community was rising. The truth was finally being heard. And Sarah, against all odds, had sparked a movement. And in that moment, she realized something. She wasn't alone anymore. The fight for justice was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who had been wronged. And they were all standing together, louder than ever before. The community had awakened, and nothing would ever silence them again. 1 year had passed since Sarah Wilson took her stand against the broken justice system. A lot had changed in that time, though not everything. The system, despite all the cracks Sarah had exposed, had not crumbled entirely. The forces that had once run unchecked still held power, but now their grip was weakening. The silence that had allowed the corruption to fester was no longer an option. People were speaking out. People were standing up. And that, Sarah knew, was the beginning of something much bigger than the beginning. It had been a quiet, solitary fight. Sarah had faced the overwhelming pressure of threats, doubts, and obstacles. But through her determination, through her refusal to let the truth be buried, she had inspired a movement fueled not by anger alone, but by hope, by the belief that change was possible. Even in a world as broken as the one they lived in, Sarah looked back over the past year. She couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at how far they had come. Yes, the system wasn't completely overhauled yet, but people were no longer complacent. They were no longer willing to let injustice slide. The protests, the rallies, the social media campaigns, those things weren't just noise. They were the voices of the silenced, the voices of those who had been erased from history. And those voices were getting louder, stronger, and more unified by the day. What had once been a quiet, underground fight had exploded into the public consciousness. The media had finally turned its spotlight on the truth. Journalists who had once hesitated to report on the corruption now found themselves digging deeper, uncovering even more than Sarah had initially uncovered. The system, though still intact, was now under constant scrutiny. But the most powerful change was the one that couldn't be seen on paper. It wasn't the headlines or the courtrooms. It was the hearts and minds of the people. The community had woken up. They had seen what had been done to them, to their families, to their neighborhoods, and they had made the decision to never go back to the way things were. Sarah had done more than just expose corruption. She had given the people their voice back. She had shown them that silence was no longer an option. The fear that had once kept people in the shadows was being replaced by courage, by a fierce desire for change. Sarah hadn't just inspired a movement. She had sparked a revolution, not of violence, but of truth. And in a world where truth was a rare commodity, that made all the difference. She had reached out to the families who had been victims of this broken system, restoring their identities and bringing their stories to light. She had made them realize that they were not alone, that their suffering had not been forgotten, and that their pain was real. Through her work, those families found the strength to speak out, to stand together, and to fight for the justice that had been denied to them for so long. Of course, the road hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks. There had been moments when it seemed like the system would push back harder than ever, trying to reclaim control. But Sarah never wavered. She knew that this fight was bigger than her. It was about every person who had been wronged by a system that was supposed to protect them. And every step forward, every victory, no matter how small, was a win for justice. One day, as Sarah sat at her desk, reflecting on everything that had happened, she received an email that made her pause. It was a message from a mother who had been one of the first to speak out after Sarah's investigation. Her son, who had been wrongfully convicted of a crime he didn't commit, had been released from prison. The mother's words were simple, but they carried a weight that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "You did it. You gave my son his life back. You gave us all hope." That was the moment Sarah realized that change had truly begun. It wasn't in the headlines or the rallies. It wasn't in the courtroom battles. It was in the small, personal victories, like this mother's gratitude, like the families who had found their voices, like the people who had once been too scared to speak now standing tall, proud, and unafraid. Sarah had done something few could ever claim. She had changed lives. She had brought justice to those who had been erased. And in doing so, she had shown the world that the fight for justice was never a fight that could be won alone. It was a collective effort, a community coming together, refusing to be silenced, refusing to be ignored. As she reflected on everything that had been accomplished, Sarah knew there was still work to be done. The battle was far from over, but she had seen the power of truth, the power of one voice, and the power of a united community. She knew that if they could keep pushing, keep fighting, they would eventually bring about the change they so desperately needed. The fight for justice wasn't over. It had just begun. If you're inspired by Sarah's story, if you believe in the power of truth, in the power of standing up against injustice, we invite you to join the movement. Subscribe to the channel, stay informed, and be part of the change. Your voice matters. Together, we can continue to push for a better, fairer world, one where no one is silenced, and where justice is truly for all. Because silence is no longer an option.